Welcome to China Truths. In this episode, we will bring you the following stories. China's property bubble may be bursting. The surge of cheap Chinese exports, why developing countries are pushing back. Now, let's dive into the details. It's all covered in today's China Truths. China's property bubble may be bursting. China's property bubble, one of the nation's key economic drivers and a source of its demographic problems, may be bursting. Property values and investments are declining, and land developers are in distress. The situation could become worse as more property units are completed and enter the market. For years, China's property values headed in one direction, up. Newly built homes and apartments became the favored assets of the country's new class of landlords, who invested the fortunes accumulated in other parts of the economy. Easy money supplied by state banks and investment companies, the easing of regulations, and hyped expectations of further gains also added to the mania. Rising property values were music to the ears of land developers, usually state-owned enterprises, and to Beijing, which could tout the contribution of construction projects to the country's economic growth. The Chinese government allowed a booming real estate market to expand with few regulations. New personal wealth was created from property investments and funding construction projects that moved more citizens into the middle class, Jerry O'Reilly, a real estate investor at Cash Home Buyers Crew said. Government officials feared slowing the expansion might create unrest when some citizens already had wealth while others were starting to invest and see huge economic boons, so they did little to regulate the industry. However, rising property values weren't great for China's average young citizens looking to purchase a home and raise a family. This could explain the country's urgent demographic problem, the plunge in marriages and birth rates, which has far-reaching consequences for China's ability to compete in labor-intensive industries and sustain the current economic growth. Yet, bubbles cannot keep swelling forever, as the pool of speculators, who buy properties just on the belief that they can find other speculators willing to pay ever higher prices, dries up. That's when the music stops for the beneficiaries of the bubble, property prices fall, landlords are left with unsellable properties, banks and investment firms suffer mounting losses, and the government is left to foot the bill to bail out these institutions. This happened in many countries before, from the Soviet Union in the 1950s and Nigeria in the 1960s to Japan in the early 1990s. It happened in China in the late 1990s, too, and it has happened again in the past couple of years as the country's government bureaucrats are beginning to worry about the sheer size of the bubble and take steps to ease its impact on the broader economy. The housing market was 25 to 29% of China's GDP in 2023, O'Reilly said. The government has finally passed new regulations to diversify the economy, a move away from the heavy reliance on property. These regulations accelerated the decline in property values already underway. The average price of newly built homes in 70 Chinese cities declined at an annual rate of 5.9% in October, following a 5.8% decline in September. It marked the 16th consecutive month of decrease and the steepest pace since April 2015. Price declines were widespread across all major cities. Meanwhile, property investment spending fell by 10.3% year-over-year in October, following a 10.1% decline in September. While Beijing expanded regulations to tame the property bubble, the People's Bank of China, PBC, slashed official borrowing rates to ease the impact of the shortfall from the decline in property values and investments that followed. In October, PBC Governor Pan Gongsheng said the central bank might further reduce the reserve requirement ratio by 25 to 50 basis points by year-end to improve liquidity conditions. However, the central bank's efforts to ease liquidity came too late to prevent some land developers from getting into trouble. Two of China's largest developers, Evergrande and Country Garden, for example, defaulted on major loans last year, followed by Yuzhou Group's default a few months ago and its $6.7 billion restructuring, and Zhongji Enterprise Group's recent insolvency. This created a wave of investor fear in the real estate sector, O'Reilly said. This meant fewer people bought property as an investment, and still fewer invested cash to fund new construction. He said the problem could worsen, as China has many prepaid units that developers still need to complete. The developers don't have access to the cash to complete the sold housing units. An additional 60 million units have been completed but are still unsold, O'Reilly said. That amounts to a 4-year supply of housing. Investors want to avoid spending additional money to complete the prepaid units, so they sit unfinished and abandoned. Michael Ashley Schulman, CFA, partner, and chief investment officer of Running Point Capital Advisors, said massive property deflation has already occurred. Now it is a matter of picking up the pieces and rebuilding confidence by raising excess inventory, tearing down or completing unfinished projects, and re-incentivizing home ownership through low interest rates and heavy government incentive, he said. Unless a wholesale cleansing is done, personal real estate could be in a quagmire for years. The surge of cheap Chinese exports, why developing countries are pushing back. The massive export of cheap Chinese goods has not only sparked resistance in developed economies like the US and Europe but has also upset many developing countries, prompting them to implement countermeasures. After China's real estate sector, a key driver of its economic growth, plunged into crisis, authorities pivoted urgently to the manufacturing sector in hopes of finding an alternative engine to revive the economy. However, this shift has resulted in overcapacity, exacerbated by weak domestic demand. The Chinese government aims to offload surplus products to developing countries like Indonesia, Brazil, and Thailand. According to the Wall Street Journal, many developing countries are pushing back because cheap Chinese imports pressure local factories, reduce jobs, and hinder the growth of domestic manufacturing industries. For years, poorer countries have relied on expanding manufacturing as the best way to boost their economies and elevate their global standing. China's surge of cheap exports mirrors the China shock experienced by the US and the global economy in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when the influx of low-cost Chinese goods led to job losses in local manufacturing. Researchers like MIT economics professor David Autor estimate that over 2 million U.S. jobs were lost between 1999 and 2011 due to imports from China. Many developing countries now fear a repeat of this scenario. According to the nonprofit Global Trade Alert, developing countries have implemented nearly 250 trade defense measures targeting Chinese imports since early 2022. These include tariffs, anti-dumping investigations, and anti-subsidy probes. Brazil has led with over 120 such interventions, including doubling import tariffs on certain steel products like wires and cables. Brazilian businesses are even calling for a complete ban on imports. In India, officials have raised tariffs on Chinese imports such as circuit boards, industrial lasers, and vinyl film used in signage. India argues that Chinese competition not only harms its domestic market but also squeezes the profits of emerging market companies overseas. In October, Indonesia banned Temu, a cross-border e-commerce platform under China's Pinduoduo, citing risks of predatory pricing. Temu ships cheap goods directly from Chinese factories to global consumers. Indonesia's government stated that this model makes it hard for small local businesses to compete. The influx of low-cost Chinese clothing and textiles has caused a crisis in Indonesia's garment industry. Indonesian Trade Minister Zulkifli Hasan noted that massive imports have led to factory closures and widespread layoffs, describing the situation as dire. From January to July 2024 alone, at least 12 textile factories shut down, leaving over 12,000 workers unemployed, according to the Nusantara Trade Union Confederation. In June, Hasan announced a 100% to 200% tariff on Chinese products, including footwear, clothing, textiles, cosmetics, and ceramics. The tariffs took immediate effect upon announcement. The flood of Chinese exports has overwhelmed competitors in certain industries. In March, CAP, Chile's largest steel producer, announced the closure of its Huachipato steel plant, unable to compete with Chinese steel priced 40% lower. Chile imposed temporary tariffs of 24.9% on steel bars and 33.5% on steel balls imported from China in April. These measures may be extended pending anti-dumping investigations. In South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa told Chinese leader Xi Jinping in September that he wants to reduce South Africa's trade deficit with China. In Thailand, the Joint Standing Committee on Commerce, Industry, and Banking, JCIB, reported in August that the influx of Chinese industrial products has hurt Thai trade, reduced regional market share, and contributed to a $20 billion trade deficit with China. Payong Srivanik, chairman of the Thai Bankers Association, warned that more businesses could shut down if protective measures are not implemented. Kring Krithianukul, chairman of the Federation of Thai Industries, FTI, highlighted that 667 factories closed in the first half of this year, a year-on-year increase of 86.3%, averaging 111 closures per month. He called for tariffs on specific Chinese products. To counteract the situation, Thailand imposed a 7% value-added tax, VAT, on all imported goods starting in July, ending the previous exemption for items priced below 1,500 baht, or about $44. This temporary policy, lasting until December, aims to give the government time to devise long-term solutions. The influx of cheap Chinese goods has intensified tensions between Beijing and developing countries in the global south. These challenges complicate China's efforts to build international alliances against the U.S. by courting these nations. China's strategy of economic diplomacy faces obstacles as its export practices disrupt local industries in developing economies.